Welcome to Paranormal or Reality. On today's video, we explore some creepy encounters working at a prison. We have started a new podcast that combines multiple videos. If you prefer listening to longer videos, the link will be in the description. Now, let's begin. 3 years ago, during my electrical apprenticeship, I was working for a contractor that mainly did state contract work. The biggest job I worked on for that contractor was in an operational prison. We were remodeling some offices in the cell blocks, turning them into classroom and clerical spaces. About halfway through the project, I was working in the tunnels under the cell blocks. If memory serves me, I was building a conduit run to power a panel in the cell block above. I was in a utility room with my back to the door working. I turned around to get something from my cart and noticed the door was closed. The doors in the tunnel were all thick, heavy steel doors that scrape the concrete when you open or close them. This particular door was warped and only opened about 2 feet. Funny thing is, I did not hear the door move. In my mind, I'm thinking the guard that shadows us while inside is messing with me. So I opened the door with the expected screeching of metal on concrete. I looked around and I saw the guard about 100 yards back towards the entrance to the tunnel. This particular guard was a heavy-set older gentleman, very likable, very out of shape. So, I walked down to where he was sitting, feet straight out with ankles crossed, snoring. I approached him and asked him if he was messing with me. He denied it, saying he was asleep the whole time. The man was not in any kind of shape to quietly close a dragging steel door, then sprint 100 yards without being winded and breathing heavy. So I believed him and went back to work. Back in my little workspace, I get wise and work with all my stuff inside, and I only had my back to the door for limited time. A few minutes after I resumed what I was doing, I was standing by my cart facing the door, when the door slammed shut with enough force for me to feel wind. This time the door screeched and slammed quite loud. It was loud enough that the guard came down to check it out. I was down in that same tunnel, working in a crawl space. I was hanging brackets to support conduit that we were going to use to feed a panel we were going to hang in the cell block above. There wasn't anything really that stands out about these crawl spaces. None of them felt really sinister or anything. They were raised up off the ground. Thankfully, when it rains, the tunnels tend to get a lot of water. They were concrete floored and about 3 feet tall. Tore up my knees crawling around in them. I had done work in a few of these crawl spaces before this one. I think it was cell block B. All the cell blocks were alphabetical. This particular crawl space had a light, but it did not work. Hard hat headlamps were crucial in the tunnel. So I'm in this crawl space working. I only had 1 or 2 supports mounted. I'm hammer drilling holes for anchor points, and I get this sudden feeling of being watched. I turn around to look towards the opening, thinking the guard or my partner were looking in on my work. But no one was there. Back to work I go. I got the bracket mounted up, and I felt that feeling again. This time I feel the gaze from a dark corner far to the opposite side of the space. I never heard anyone come into the space, but I knew someone was in that corner. I turned my head to look in that direction, and my coworker yelled from outside it's lunchtime. I kind of hauled it out of there, but as I stepped out into the ladder to exit, I looked into that corner. The only thing there was what looked like an old rag. We did work in cell blocks from A to H, and I only felt that kind of direct attention in a crawl space twice. Both times it was very similar, except in the second crawl space there was nothing else visible in the space with me. The first experience I actually ever had down in the tunnels started off with a conversation. As I remember it, me, my tool partner, and 2 guards had just entered the tunnel when the guards were explaining the procedures in the tunnel. How we were only supposed to have 2 of the doors down there open at once. How we can have the crash gate, a gate that splits the tunnel in half in case of riots. Another gate mirrors the tunnel gate in the cell blocks above. Unlocked, but it has to stay closed. And how 1 guard would have to remain in the tunnel until we left for the day. The whole time the guards were speaking to us, I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my left eye, like a pacing back and forth in front of a light. It was blocking the light, which I think is why I noticed it. I must have had a puzzled look on my face because my guard, we both had one assigned to us personally because we would be split up often. one above and one in the tunnel, asked me if I had a question. Well, I guess I did. I asked if anyone else noticed the person pacing at the end of the tunnel. The guard kind of looked at me funny, not like he thought I was crazy, more like a knowing look. My tool partner did, however, call me crazy, and we went on with the day with no other incidents. A few weeks later, but still before my first story, and really close to the same time as my second story, maybe days apart from the crawl space incidents. We were a little further down the tunnel. I want to say we were right by the gates, because the photo I took was taken from beside the gate. We were having a bull session before we got to work. Once again, I was seeing the pacing man, but this time, I didn't mention it. I watched the guard's eyes. I noticed he kept firing glances that direction. Then he suddenly and quickly turned his head towards it, which made me look as well. About halfway between us, and where we saw the pacing man, was a stack of boxes. There, leaning out from behind those boxes, we saw in plain sight a man in a brown prison uniform. We kind of looked at each other. Then the guard went into action. I grabbed a pipe bender and followed. I had to provide backup, not because of a rule, but because we were supposed to be alone down there. We walked down to where we saw the figure and found nothing. This is when I noticed that where we saw the pacing man was a ramp that goes down to another gate, which I was told leads to the main road and is the entrance point for the utilities. The light was about 6 feet off the ground above the gate. I walked over for a closer inspection. Then I noticed a half-inch water line was jumping like someone was shaking it. I wrote that off as a mouse or a giant roach. I swear I saw one carrying a dead frog down there. This is when my guard told me of his own personal experiences, which are my next 2 stories. Everything else that happened were either explainable or just feelings. Feelings of rage or sorrow. Things would be moved, but we figured the guards were having fun. So I've been laying here in my bed scratching at the wall to mess with one of my roommates, and suddenly felt like this is the perfect time to relay one of the stories my prison guard escort told me shortly after we both saw what we thought was a man lean out from behind some boxes in the tunnel of a prison. I have no reason to think this story was made up, but I cannot confirm any details of this or the next story. I will tell this story in the first person to save a little typing, but these are his words, not mine. I used to work night shift when I first started here in the prison. I always signed up for, but never got the rover job. Rover is a guard that sits in the guard shack and makes rounds twice a shift to check every door and every gate to ensure they are locked, and checks the perimeter fences to make sure they have not been tampered with. One night I finally got what I thought was going to be the easiest shift I've ever had. I landed the rover job. During that shift, my first trip around the perimeter and gates went just fine. Everything was as it should be. However, my second round was a little different. I was patrolling the tunnel access points, checking the gates and doors as I had done earlier that day. In the tunnel, there are 3 books that the rover must sign to prove they made their appointed rounds. I had books A and B signed. I just had book C to go. Book C lay down a long and dark corridor. Picture a long hallway with one bare bulb lighting up a patch of the path every 20 or 30 feet. I entered the hallway and closed and locked the gate behind me. As I started to walk towards the bookend of the hall, I heard footsteps behind me. I hurried to the first patch of light and looked behind me. No one there. When I stopped, so did the accompanying footsteps, so I wrote it off as an echo. I continued on, and as soon as I exited the patch of light, the footsteps returned this time, just a little faster, almost like it was trying to catch up. Once again in the next patch of light, I stopped and looked for my pursuer. And again, I saw nothing, and the steps stopped. I turned and looked towards book C. It's 2 more patches of light away. It actually was in a 3rd patch by itself, like a beacon of safety. I'm starting to get a little nervous about now, so I pull out my flashlight and shine it around. My light illuminates nothing but the damp walls of this part of the tunnel, so I keep on walking. As soon as I left that patch of light, I hear those steps again, only this time it sounds like they are jogging towards me. I quickly spin around and shine my light towards the sound, and once again, see nothing. I decided now is not the time to mess around, so I ran to the last light and the book so I can get the hell out of this tunnel. As I reached the book, I could hear the steps sprinting towards me. I quickly signed my name in the book, and as I wrote down the time, I heard a heavy sigh behind me. And right in my ear, a husky voice whispered my name. I slowly turned my head towards the sigh. Seeing nothing, I sprinted out of there, stopping only long enough to lock the doors behind me. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I can still feel the breath on my ear from when it whispered my name. I put in for a shift change right away, and I never signed up for rover duty again. This particular story was told to me by the guard assigned to me a few days after the Leaning Man story happened. It is also the only story told to me that was witnessed by several guards who I spoke with as well. As with the other story told to me, I did not see this with my own eyes and cannot confirm or deny this story happened. I also do not see any reason why several guards would all tell the same story and lie to me about it either. This is the story of Cell Block C and the Tier 3 Spirit. As in the previous story, I will tell this in the first person to save a little time. I was working second shift in Cell Block C. Each cell block has 2 officers assigned to it, one to man the desk and one to patrol the block. My partner and I were getting set for lights out, just about to initiate lockdown with the last count of the day, in which the inmates can be out of their cells. We called for the count, then started the head count. Each cell block was arranged in a 3-tier setup. They were shaped like a U, with a staircase on each side near the front desk. As one officer walks the count, the other waits by the desk. When the first officer completed the count, the officer that stayed at the desk recounts to make sure the numbers match. This process can take a while, especially if the inmates decide to play games. After count, we lock down. The inmates get about 2 hours in their cell before lights out. When it came time to shut off the lights, we both walked the tiers one more time to make sure all the beds had a body. 2 hours after lights out, we decided to do an impromptu unofficial count to stave off the boredom. We both walked the first tier, and each of us took one of the upper tiers. I took Tier 3. As I was walking along the tier, an inmate towards the middle of the tier started yelling towards us, asking for help with something. It was not medical related, so we just yelled back for him to shut it. Then the inmate got a bit more belligerent, spitting curse words calling us lazy. I started towards the area where the yelling was coming from. By now the inmate was beating in the door, so it was quite easy to identify. As I reached the door to get the inmate's name and number for the write-up, the sound ceased. No beating, no swearing, no yelling. I looked into the door's window, and no one was in the cell. I looked into the cell on the left and the right and saw 4 inmates, 2 to a cell, pale as a ghost with fear, cowering in the darkness as far from the door as they could get. I returned to the front desk to check the cell blocks list. That's when I discovered that no one was assigned that cell. Later that night, about an hour before shift change, my partner was patrolling Tier 3. He told me that while walking by that cell, he thought he saw someone step off the toilet and hang themselves. But of course, the cell was empty. Thanks for tuning in. Watch another video if you dare.